Welcome back to Module 5 of Theology 540, Contemporary Theological Perspectives. This week we are talking about postmodernism, and so the title of the lecture is Ambitiously Understanding Postmodernism. Hopefully by the end of this lecture you will be able to understand postmodernism just a little bit more and look at some specific examples of postmodernism before diving into some of your assignments for this week. So let's get started. We begin with a classic illustration in the history of philosophy. To really understand what is going on in postmodernism, it's very helpful to understand Plato's analogy of the cave. Plato was a Greek philosopher who lived about 400 years before Christ and developed this famous illustration of prisoners who are kept within a cave. They're imprisoned and they're chained to their chairs. And behind them there's a fire, and people who move shapes and shadows on the wall in front of them between the fire and the wall. And since they're chained and their arms and legs and their necks are bound to their chairs, they're facing forward and they can only see the shadows cast on the wall. So in this analogy, Plato uses the example of people who have only ever seen shadows, and that's the only reality that they know. So if you were to release one of these prisoners and take them up out of the cave, they would come very slowly to experience things as they actually are. So rather than seeing cardboard cutouts in the shape of a cat and the shadow of a cat cast on the wall, they might see a real cat, or they might see a real table or a real chair, or really come to see nature and trees, and eventually look up and see the sun and see the light that the sun gives. Up until this point, these prisoners have never really thought about things as they actually are. They've only ever seen shadows. And so in the history of philosophy, this illustration of the cave becomes a real analogy for freedom versus slavery, for the pursuit of rational thought and enlightenment, as opposed to simply being told whatever you've been told by whomever you've been told it your whole life. And even as Plato goes on to develop this analogy, it's a metaphor for illumination and coming to a greater and greater knowledge of the world, greater and greater knowledge of the self, and even knowledge of God. So there's this progression of a soul who is bound in slavery and it's only ever known shadows, to an upward ascent of the soul that's pursuing knowledge, enlightenment, pursuing God, and in that pursuit there's this kind of liberation and freedom that happens. That's kind of the background or the context of postmodernism, or many of postmodernism's themes. A good cultural example of that might be the film The Matrix. This film's getting a little bit old now, so I'm not sure if anyone's still seen this. At least my undergraduate students are young enough that they didn't watch it or haven't watched it or weren't allowed to watch it when this film was released. But if you're familiar with Neo, he's given a choice by Morpheus whether to take the red pill and begin to see things as they actually are, which is a harsh reality for him, or to take the blue pill and he can go back into the Matrix and live the life that he's always been accustomed to and what he's been told is real. So again, we have a kind of a Plato's cave illustration here of life as I've always known it. That's a false reality and it might be comfortable, or life and knowledge for what really is, and there's that pursuit of truth. And so I want to pursue what is real. I want to understand what knowledge is, and I'd like to know that I can be sure of what's real, and I can be sure of what I know. So these are very important themes in the history of philosophy, but as we'll see, in postmodernism. One of the ways people tend to think about postmodernism is as a cultural phenomenon. So you'll hear postmodernism as a catchphrase being thrown around, and typically what it means is, at least in culture, the newest of the new, or the latest thing that's out there, or what's most fashionable. So that's a really postmodern haircut, postmodern fashion style, and we have a sense in the culture that something shifted and something has changed, and that there's a kind of thing that's happened, but no one's really sure what it is. It's almost something that's in the air, and you feel it, but you're not quite sure how to describe it or put it into words. And as Smith points out in his chapter on postmodernism, it's really a shift in our understanding of truth. Truth as something that's given, truth as something that's absolute, truth as something that's been revealed by God maybe in the scriptures, to an experiential version of truth. That is to say, a subjective experience of whatever is true for me is true for me, and whatever is true for you is true for you. And the best example that I can think of, that I see this with undergraduate students and teenagers all the time, and people in their 20s as well, kind of this millennial generation, that this focus on our own subjective experience has led to a kind of subjective morality in which I will determine for me what works morally for me, and you can determine what works morally for you, and we'll just agree to disagree and give each other space, but there's no real room for a substantive disagreement or debate about the good in which one person could actually win an argument, because you never win an argument. Nobody wins when you argue. And in fact, if you look at this generation today, they will avoid argument like the plague because somebody's feelings might get hurt. And so one of these cultural aspects of postmodernism is the way that a subjective morality and a subjective experience-based morality, one of the things that does is eliminate any kind of cultural debate about the good, any kind of rational argument or disagreement about the good is actually avoided. And we kind of put our heads in the sand and try to pretend that nothing has happened, even though everybody knows something important really has happened. Now, all of this goes back to Enlightenment rationalism, which is something that we covered at the beginning of the course, and there was a reason why we did that. Not only did that really set us up well for understanding modernism and fundamentalism and the way that fundamentalism led to evangelicalism in the middle of the 20th century, but it also helps us understand what's happening with these cultural shifts that we see in postmodernism. Now, modernism and Enlightenment rationalism aren't simply restricted to American culture, and the developments in American culture are not restricted to the relationship of evangelicalism and fundamentalism. They're kind of the world in which we live as Bible college people and Bible college students, but outside Christian spheres, culture moves on. And so there's a strong connection between Enlightenment rationalism, modernism, and postmodernism, what we're going to see in the rest of this lecture. So let's define Enlightenment rationalism as a single system of universal reason that explains everything. And this includes a combination of rational thought, something you can reason your way to and argue toward. Well, 300 years ago, they were still having arguments and debates, and no one was really afraid of argument and debate 300 years ago during the Enlightenment. But there's a combination of rational thought and empirical experience. So in other words, if you could prove something scientifically, then that wasn't up for debate anymore. Although we might disagree rationally about certain things and have different arguments, if you had empirical evidence or experience that something was true, it was almost morally required that you believe that. And yet today, we're not so sure. Now, Enlightenment rationalism is typically idealistic. It's very, very optimistic about the future of humanity and the fate of humanity, even utopian in the sense of some of the thinkers that we'll look at on the next slide, that humanity is progressing through reason and experience toward this great enlightenment as a whole race or whole species. If you recall in modules 1 and 2, we used modernism as a way of talking about liberal theology that early fundamentalism opposed itself to. It defined itself against modernism and liberal theology. So even though that is a theological movement, it's also a cultural movement in which we can understand modernism artistically, musically. We see it in architecture. We see it in the ways that cities developed during the Industrial Revolution. There's all kinds of aspects of modernism. And so as a cultural movement, not simply as a theological movement, Immanuel Kant, in terms of his Enlightenment rationalism, and G.W.F. Hegel, who spawns all of these different Hegelians, and most notably Karl Marx in his Communist Manifesto as a left-leaning Hegelian, that the progress of humanity is not simply something that happens in the mind, but it's also a cultural movement. And so as humanity is moving toward this enlightenment and this utopia, sometimes we have to act socially and culturally in order to move progressively toward that future. So if you've heard in recent years of progressivism or of a cultural movement towards hope is a theme that we'll always hear in American political cycles. That is an aspect of modernism, this idea that we all desire moving toward this dream together. And so this modernist spirit is very optimistic about the future of humanity. And that comes from Enlightenment rationalism, notably Kant and Hegel. But as we get to the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, there's increasing doubt about whether this optimism is really well placed. And in particular, you have World War I in 1914 to 1917, and massive amounts of people die. 1 million people die in World War I, which is just mind-blowing at the beginning of the 20th century. And so you start to see some responses to this optimistic modernist spirit. And one of the best ways to illustrate this, I think, is with the breakdown of truth that we see represented in the art world. These are two pieces of art from an artist named Marcel Duchamp at the beginning of the 20th century. Famously on the left, the picture is called The Treachery of Images, and on the right, you see the urinal tipped on its side, and that the title of that beautiful piece of art is called Fountain. And so what Duchamp did is he took familiar looking images or familiar looking artifacts, and he used language to kind of mess with the viewer, to kind of mess with the audience, and really call into question, radically question sometimes, whether what they're seeing is actually true or whether words can be trusted to convey truth. Right, so on the left, we have the image and the caption is, "This is not a pipe." Well, on the surface, it's right, because it's not a pipe. You could say it's a painting of a pipe. Yes, so we get it. We get the critique that to say that this is not a pipe, it's a painting of a pipe. That reminds us that the thing in itself is not the thing that we're perceiving, and so there's some modernist kind of Enlightenment philosophy going on there. But beyond that, the caption really hits us, really smacks us in the face, because you look at it immediately and you say, okay, that's a pipe, that's a familiar image, I get it, I can understand that. And yet the image is it's a second smack to the face, saying, this is not a pipe, this is not what you think it is. And so that leaves you questioning, okay, what am I perceiving, and can I trust really the reality that's before me and the knowledge that I have? Same goes with Fountain. Probably if you're like me, there's no amount of scrubbing that you would do with that urinal to get it clean enough that you would want to use it as a fountain. And so simply calling it fountain is disruptive to the viewer. And this kind of disruption, this break, this anxiety, is something that's very common in the postmodern spirit, in the postmodern impulse. Okay, so what is postmodernism? Well, if we could just define it in historical terms, we could call it a French intellectual movement that originates in post-Nazi occupied Paris as a response to World War II and the Holocaust. We'll get into Jacques Derrida in just a moment, but this would be a philosophical movement that really questions modernity. It questions this Enlightenment optimism, and it questions the kind of rationalism that leads to World War I and World War II. After all, if society were so optimistic and so progressive and so progressing toward utopia, then why in the world could World War I have happened or World War II have happened? I like to ask my students, I show them this picture and I say, what is wrong with this picture? I'll give you a moment to think about it. Usually students think it's some kind of clever photoshopping that's happened. No, what's wrong with the picture is that Hitler's there at the base of the Eiffel Tower like he's some kind of tourist on vacation. No, Hitler's not allowed to be there. You're not allowed to have Hitler in the same frame as this enduring symbol of freedom and the human spirit. That picture is so disruptive. And that's just a tiny tip of the iceberg related to what these French people experienced when the Nazis occupied Paris. Paris as the bastion of freedom, democracy, of enlightenment, progress, and optimism, and the human spirit, and then the Nazis occupy. And so this radical experience of disruption really raises questions about, is society going in the way that we want it to go, let alone the violence and the horror of the Holocaust. It's not just that the Nazis occupy Paris, it's that this whole Enlightenment modernism, particularly in the sense of German philosophy, leads to the destruction of 6 million Jews and 40 million more people in Russia in the next decades. And what we have is a really radical disruption of this modernist vision of progress and enlightenment. Now, it's also important to note that postmodernism is going to question any kind of religion or any kind of fundamentalism that attributes to our knowledge or our experience any kind of absolute certainty. Because one of the things about the Enlightenment, if you remember, is this sense of I can be absolutely certain, I can have sure and certain knowledge that what I believe is true, or that I have scientific proof that this is true. Well, the Nazis had scientific proof that the Aryan race was the greatest race, right? And they had all kinds of arguments for it. So those kinds of Enlightenment rationalizations, we could call them rationalizations instead of rational conclusions, and quote-unquote scientifically based accounts of what's true and what's real, those get called into question along with the kind of religion, even Christianity, that supports fascism or that supports National Socialism in Nazi Germany. So there's a radical questioning that's going on. And it's not just of religion, but it's also of any kind of sure and certain knowledge. So in the second half of this lecture, we are going to look closely at 3 different versions of postmodernism, one being that of Jacques Derrida and his focus on this method of deconstruction. And really, Derrida focuses on texts, religious texts, historical texts, literary texts, economic texts. He is focused on the way that texts are used as authoritative in the Western tradition, not just in modernism, but all throughout the Western tradition. So he says this about deconstruction. He says this is what deconstruction is made of. Not the mixture, but the tension. So it's a fundamental tension between memory, fidelity, and the preserving of something that has been given to us, and at the same time, heterogeneity, something absolutely new, and a break. So if you think back to those cultural shifts that we talked about earlier in the lecture, that sense that something has shifted in the society. What Derrida wants to do with deconstruction is say, well, we have memory, we have fidelity to a tradition, we have the preservation of what's been handed down to us, and at the same time, we have the perception of heterogeneity, something that's different, something absolutely new, and a break. And it's acknowledging the tension in the culture and in the shift that has happened toward truth and knowledge, toward our understanding of meaning, toward our understanding even of what's real and what's actually out there. And deconstruction works like this. So you can take a particular text on the left and you can call that text Theory X. And you can look at A, B, C, and D and what makes up Theory X. But you could also look at the hidden assumptions and biases that go along with that text. And so, for example, you might look at the pastoral epistles and say, well, the Apostle Paul, if you were doing deconstruction, that is, the Apostle Paul gives all kinds of authoritative instruction to Timothy and Titus on how to run their churches and how to have good pastors. And leadership for the local church, and elders and deacons and all that good stuff is in there. But if we are doing deconstruction, we would take a closer look at what's going on in those pastoral epistles, and we'd read between the lines a little bit. And then on the right, we take that theory and we blow it out. We look at all of the hidden assumptions and biases that are going on in that text, and we just isolate them, and we name them, and we observe them. We don't necessarily have to do anything more than that, but we might just make the observation, for example, in the pastoral epistles, that Paul is fairly harsh in his language toward women in those pastoral epistles. He says that women should keep silent in the churches. He says, I don't allow a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. Women are allowed to teach women and young children and that type of thing. And so we see some of the things that are clearly represented in those pastoral epistles, but we see them blown out, and we might exaggerate those a little bit if we're doing deconstruction and say, well, those are cultural products of their time. The Apostle Paul is just being a good Greco-Roman citizen when he thinks about women the way he does. But that's the way the deconstruction works, is it looks at any given text and it says, where are the hidden assumptions and biases? What we thought was Enlightenment rationalism and we could all argue and agree on never really took stock of some of the hidden assumptions and some of the things that were between the lines, and deconstruction points those out. And when it does that, as you could see, as I started talking about women in ministry, that can be very disruptive to people. And again, it gives that sense of deconstruction. It's the tradition that we've been handed down, that we understand as true and as firm, and yet there's this radical shift, there's a break that happens there. Like, oh, well, what if Paul is just being a good cultural citizen of his time, and maybe God doesn't mean for women in ministry to be something that's only limited toward that culture? Well, you can imagine where the debate goes, and I'll leave some of those questions for your thesis work and other professors, since we're really not talking about that here. Our second take on postmodernism comes from Jean-Francois Lyotard, who was a Canadian philosopher who was commissioned by the Canadian government in the late 1970s to produce a report on the status of knowledge. The leadership of Canada wanted to understand what's happening socially and culturally, and so they asked one of their leading philosophers to make a report of this. So Lyotard sums it up in this way. He says, our working hypothesis is that the status of knowledge is altered as societies enter what is known as the post-industrial age and cultures enter what is known as the postmodern age. Now, if you think about it, in the late 1970s and early 80s, they didn't have an information age yet. They didn't know that the internet was coming. And so maybe they would call it the microchip age or the age of the computer, but nobody really knew. So Lyotard is remarkable here in that he calls it a post-industrial age, in other words, the age that comes after the Industrial Revolution. And his point is that knowledge, the status of knowledge, has changed. Again, referring back to that cultural shift that we talked about at the beginning of this lecture. Lyotard observed that in the modern period, in the Enlightenment rationalism stage of the history of philosophy, that you could maybe use the Encyclopedia Britannica as an illustration of encyclopedic knowledge of everything that human beings know. And that was kind of a pretentious, one of the ways that the modern period was very arrogant, its ability to claim that here's all the knowledge you could know, and we'll put them in 26 volumes and you can buy them for a couple $1,000s for your kids. I feel like I talked about this in an earlier lecture, but it's ringing a bell for me anyway. Anyhow, in the postmodern age, in the information age, we would use Wikipedia as an example of the status of knowledge having shifted to this democratic, open source, free way of getting knowledge. Now we'll leave aside for the moment debates about whether you can trust the knowledge that you gain on Wikipedia and whether you should use it for your papers. You certainly shouldn't in a grad program, but I use Wikipedia all the time. The point is that we have two different ways of approaching knowledge. Can you imagine 20 years ago someone telling you, don't buy the Encyclopedia Britannica because 20 years from now there's going to be a vast online encyclopedia that's searchable, and not only is it free, but it's going to have thousands of times more information than Encyclopedia Britannica ever had. It's going to be up to date, it's going to be current, relevant, it'll never go out of date, and it's going to be editable by you and me and anyone, whether they're experts in their field or not. It's going to be this completely free, completely democratic way of getting knowledge. And so you'd probably balk at that and you'd say, well, that's not possible. I have this Encyclopedia Britannica. It should be good for the rest of my life. I paid $2,000 for it, or whatever you actually paid back then. Now, Lyotard's point is that the status of knowledge has shifted. The status of knowledge has altered from an industrial way of thinking about knowledge to a post-industrial or an information age way of thinking about knowledge. And what this has led to for Lyotard is this quote at the bottom: incredulity toward meta-narratives. In other words, postmodernism distrusts and disbelieves those big stories, those meta-narratives that claim to have authority and dominance over everything. Age of Reason, Enlightenment, progressivism, utopian visions, scientific explanations for everything. Postmodernism questions all of that, especially whenever somebody claims absolute knowledge. A great illustration of this is the film O Brother, Where Art Thou?, in which George Clooney's character, Ulysses Everett McGill, plays this quintessential modernist. And he goes through all of these experiences where he experiences the supernatural, he experiences miracles, they happen right in front of his face, and yet he's still holding on to his meta-narrative of reason, science, and evidence-based experience explanations of everything. And he has this quote. He says at the end of the film, "Yes, sir, the South is going to change. Everything's going to run on a paying basis. Out with the spiritual mumbo-jumbo and the backward ways. We're going to see a brave new world where they hook us all up to a grid. Yes, a veritable age of reason, like the one they had in France, and not a moment too soon." So what's really funny in the film is that even though Ulysses Everett McGill holds to his meta-narrative of the superiority of reason and enlightenment and scientific explanations for all of the miracles that he sees, right after he makes this quote, he sees a fulfillment of prophecy. I don't want to ruin the film for you, but he sees a fulfilled prophecy from the beginning of the film that he can't deny based on his reason. And so it's a great illustration of the way that postmodernism calls into question these enlightenment-based explanations of everything. So for Lyotard, the focus of his assessment of knowledge is this question about narratives versus absolutes. Narratives, or stories, are one way of providing meaning, whereas absolutes, whether they're revealed in religious knowledge or you're absolutely certain of it, like you're mathematically certain that 2 + 2 = 4, that stories provide a better basis for meaning in postmodernism than do absolutes. So you should think of absolutes, absolute truth, absolute morality. You should connect that with Enlightenment rationalism and modernity. Now that's kind of hard for us because as fundamentalists and evangelicals, we tend to connect absolutes and the truth of what we believe with Scripture and that being revealed. And yet, and we think of that as neither modern nor postmodern, that's just something that's given. But from a postmodern standpoint, it's better to see the Scripture as a kind of narrative or story because it actually can form your Christian faith better as a story than it can as a book of absolutes or a book of absolutely true principles, for example, because of course those have to be mediated through a pastor or a theologian or a teacher or somebody who looks at the Bible and tells you what the absolutes are in it, and which ones are absolute and which ones are relative and which ones are horizontal and which ones are vertical and which ones were for a previous dispensation and which ones are for this dispensation. So even though there's absolutes in the Bible, you have to have long conversations about which absolutes absolutely apply in your situation, right? So it's very complicated. A lot of the things that we take for granted with regard to our knowledge of the Bible are more species of modern and Enlightenment ways of thinking about what Scripture is telling us or what we learn in the Bible. So back to narratives and meta-narrative realism. Well, we can observe, and this is from James K. Smith, he says we can observe that the Christian faith has a narrative character. In other words, when we talk about what's going on in the Bible, when we talk about what's going on in Jesus, we're almost always going to find ourselves telling a story about what is happening. That's actually one of your assignments for this week, is to provide that meta-narrative of the whole Bible. And that may be easy for some of you, that may be challenging for some of you, because you're going to be describing the Scriptures as a story rather than as a world of abstract ideas or simply doctrines. Again, one of the ironies here is that in our fundamentalistic ways of approaching Scripture and doctrine, we're often more modernistic in our approach than we really are biblical. And that's just something for you to think about. Okay, second bullet point, Smith says that narratives are confessional, relativistic, and communal. Now, what he means by this is not relativistic in the negative sense that you're thinking of. In other words, narratives express our confession, what we actually believe as Christians. Narratives are relative to their own communities and the people who confess and believe these stories. Maybe an example of this would be Star Wars versus Star Trek, right? There are people who are Star Wars people, and there are people who are Star Trek people, and never the two shall meet. They are two totally different worlds. They're two totally different groups of people. They have their own confessions of faith. They have their own conventions and their own meetings. They have their own clubs. They have their own textual basis and all their knowledge. And so those stories are relative to those communities that carry on those stories, right? And so what we would say from a postmodern standpoint is, may the best story win. You've got a story, I've got a story. It's up to both of us to tell a more compelling story, a more winsome story, a more attractive story, and then get people to believe that, rather than, as we would in a modern context, or if you think back to the fundamentals, demanding that people look at the evidence for what we believe, whether that's biblically or archaeologically or rationally or scientifically, and then expecting them to agree with all the facts, right? That, again, that's a rationalistic, modernist approach as opposed to a postmodern approach. Okay, our third tack, coming after postmodernism here, is Michel Foucault, another French philosopher, more of a historian, really, but his work ended up being very influenced by philosophy and very influential in the world of philosophy. His famous books include Discipline and Punish and The Birth of the Clinic, in which he traces the history of the penal system in Western society, and also the history of the mental institution in society. And so his theory revolves around the idea that knowledge leads to power. Whoever has the most knowledge has the most power, and therefore whoever has the most power has the most social control. And some ways to think about that would be to look at the education system in America, something most of us are all familiar with. If you look at healthcare, or the correction system in the United States. And I'll just use education and healthcare as an example. And you might be thinking to yourself, yeah, my high school sort of did look like a prison and felt like a prison when I was in it. Well, Foucault would say there's something to that. If you went to South Kitsap High School like I did, you definitely get the penal system aspect, like the high fences all around it, the very blocky shaped, like industrial looking buildings that kind of controlled the traffic flow and kept you going where you're going. Yeah, schools are sort of like prisons, and they keep us inside, don't they? They're meant to keep people inside. Or think about this. If you've ever been in the hospital and let's say you wanted to leave the hospital. Let's say you have an IV and you want to be like that person in your favorite show or in the movies who like takes their own IV out and just walks out of the hospital in the gown because you have to get away, because Jason Bourne is chasing you or something like that, or you are Jason Bourne and the bad guys are chasing you. In any event, you have to get out of the hospital. Well, if you've ever been in the hospital, it's inconceivable that you would actually do that, right? Because even now, as they come and check you in, there's the person rolling around on the little rolly table, and they've got the computer, and they check you in, and you feel very safe, and you feel very controlled, and you say, well, this is the place that we're going to make you well, and you wouldn't leave, right? Because even if you're in the hospital under normal circumstances, say you or your wife has a baby or something like that, and you just want to normally leave, well, it still takes you all these steps in this whole process to try to get out of the hospital, right? You're under their control. You're under their power because they have the knowledge and they have the systems to keep you in line. These are some observations that Foucault made about society. Foucault gives the example of the panopticon, which is a famous prison system in which the prisoners are in a ring around a central column in which there's a lighthouse, essentially, and the light shines on the prisoners to constantly monitor what they're doing. So a prisoner never knows, even though they might be sitting in the dark, they never know when the light is going to shine on them and their deeds could be exposed, whatever, if they're trying to escape or something like that. So because the possibility of the light shining on them was always there, they were under the control of the prison system because somebody was always watching. Now, if you think about this, on the way this translates to the education system, to the healthcare system, to the penal system, I would extend it even to entertainment and the movies and the media, that our behavior is very much controlled by all kinds of invisible systems of knowledge and power that we don't think about very often, right? And sometimes when those things start to get exposed, it can be very unsettling. And then there's that postmodern shift happens, and you feel that cultural aspect of things all seem like they've always been the same, but yet something has shifted and something is different. And one of the aspects of that is our own awareness that we are being shaped by marketing, that we are being shaped by capitalism and consumerism, that we are being shaped by political forces that are outside our control, maybe even some international forces that are outside our control, that we are, for lack of a better word, trapped and imprisoned by the forces of education and healthcare and media. That in many respects, it's like we're in Plato's cave all over again, and we're under this control. And what really needs to happen is to be freed and liberated from that, and to come out from that. Foucault, in his philosophy, doesn't actually provide any ways for us to do that. Instead, he's simply, in this postmodern way, unmasking those things. He's making the invisible visible for us, which is unsettling and freeing at the same time. Well, what can we do about all of this? How can Christians respond to postmodernism? One of the suggestions that Jamie Smith makes in his book, Who's Afraid of Postmodernism, is this idea of radical orthodoxy. And there's a couple of images that I'll take to finish off our lecture from the film Whale Rider, which is the greatest movie you've never seen. You should definitely watch Whale Rider if you haven't done that before, especially if you have girls. If you have daughters, it's a great empowering film for girls and young women. But what Smith does is he focuses on a return to tradition, trying to bring the new out of the old, to respond to some of these cultural shifts, not by going forward into postmodernism, but by going back before modernism happened and returning to a pre-modern take on things like scripture and liturgy and worship, as opposed to a modernistic kind of focus on doctrine and orthodoxy. So the radically orthodox part is that yes, you believe all the right things, you believe all the things that Christians have always believed, but you are also going to return to radical ways of practicing the Christian faith in terms of liturgy, into radical ways of witnessing for the Christian faith, in terms of your testimony and how you live your Christian life, and radical ways of formation and service that are kind of counter-formation to the education system and to the media and the marketing that we and our kids are constantly exposed to. Maybe an emphasis on witness and witness to the wider non-Christian world versus conversion to Christ. So maybe not a evangelism explosion, kind of four spiritual laws approach to sharing the gospel, but more of an ongoing lifestyle. And in all of these things, what Smith wants to do, what radical orthodoxy wants to do, is make the gospel strange. Like when people see Christians, they think, wow, that's weird. I've never seen that before. I've never seen people forgiving their enemies before. I've never seen people laying down their lives and sacrificing their lives for their faith before. I've seen Christians kind of yell about stuff on Facebook, and I've seen Christians try to get involved politically and control the society and try to legislate their morality on everyone else. But if Christians were to live in this radically orthodox way, Smith thinks, that would make the gospel strange and a little bit more winsome, a little bit more intriguing and maybe attractive to the wider Christian world. And I don't want to spoil Whale Rider for you, but Smith likens this kind of new way of being Christian in a postmodern era to the main character of the film, Paikea, who's the heroine of Whale Rider, and asking how do Christians respond to postmodernism? How do they respond to these cultural shifts? This sense that everything's been disrupted and I can't know for sure what's real, or can't be really 100% certain that I believe what I believe and the status of my knowledge has changed. That can create a lot of fear for people and a lot of unsettling emotions regarding the things that we see happening in society and the wider culture. But the question is, are we going to fear that and kind of keep it at arm's length in a fundamentalistic way, or are we going to approach that with some constructive theology and critical thinking? And again, I think you will see that in the examples of the emergent church that we look at this week. Even though the emergent church is kind of a thing that happened in the last 20 years and you don't hear a lot about it today, it seems to me a critical moment in the ecclesiology of the West, in that you have Christians who are looking at all of these postmodern trends and postmodern shifts and really trying to respond constructively, both in how they think in terms of doctrine, how they tell the story of the Christian faith, how they witness to the Christian faith, but most especially how they live out their ecclesiological lives and how they do church in a postmodern world. So, in postmodernism, we're not simply going forward. It's not just the latest of the late great things that have been happening, but it can actually be a return to everything that's old, to the history of the Christian faith, bringing the scriptures back to our worship services, bringing the reading of scripture and the public of reading of scripture back to front and center in our worship, not simply sermons, not simply doctrinal statements, not simply flashy lights and ground smoke in our worship services, but really returning to some of those older, maybe more liturgical ways of being Christian, and then following up with that in terms of our discipleship and our spiritual formation. And that's going to lead to the kind of church that can still be the church, even though we've entered a vastly different postmodern world.